I'm Tom Carrico. I'm a senior fellow here at the in the International Security Program here at CSIS, and I also direct the Missile Defense Project. We're delighted to kick off our event this morning with Senator Dan Sullivan, who has represented the great state of Alaska for 2 years. He's on several committees: Commerce, Science and Transportation, Environment and Public Works, Veterans Affairs, and Senate Armed Services, and within SASC, the Strategic Forces Subcommittee. He's previously served as Alaska's Attorney General and as Commissioner for Alaska's Department of Natural Resources. He's also previously served in the Bush administration as Assistant Secretary of State for Economic, Energy and Business under Secretary Rice, and on the National Security Council staff as Director in the International Economics Directorate. But we know Senator Sullivan here at CSIS as a friend and frequent visitor. He's been here several times since being in the Senate, including to speak on the Arctic, the South China Sea, and China. But this is the first time we've had him speak on missile defense, so we're glad to do that, and the floor is yours, sir. All right.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you.
Okay, good, thanks. Thank you. Okay, good morning, everybody, and I want to begin by once again thanking CSIS. Tom, I want to thank you. Great work that you're doing, great report. Dr. Hamry, your team is world class, and I've gotten to know so many over the years, but one of the things that you're good at, and I'll certainly admit it here, is making policy makers like myself get a little smarter on the issues. And certainly with regard to missile defense, that's what I've been trying to do since I came to the Senate, given how important it is for our country. And so thank you, and thank all of you who contribute. It's an honor to be able to speak on some of these issues. If you turn on the TV, you might see there's a little bit going on in the world right now. And a little bit going on in the Senate, too. We got a vote coming up in a couple hours. It's pretty important, pretty historic with regard to the Supreme Court. President's down in Florida meeting with Xi Jinping. We had the issues last night with regard to Syria, so a lot going on. And there's a lot going on in this area, too, which is what I wanted to focus on, but certainly in the Q&A, I'd be glad to take any questions with regard to all the different things happening in the world right now. Let me just kind of give you a sense of what I've been raising with regard to missile defense, literally hearing after hearing after hearing, closed hearings, public hearings on the Armed Services Committee. Just this week, we had General Hyten testifying both in a closed session and an open session, the Commander of Strategic Command. We had General Robinson, the head of NORTHCOM. But here's my biggest concern. And I think we all have a responsibility to address it. Some point, and this is all public, in the not too distant future, it's not if, but when, North Korea is going to be able to test and have the capability to fire an intercontinental ballistic nuclear missile that can hit the lower 48 of the United States. That's going to happen. We don't know when. There's estimates. The classified estimates might be a little scarier than some of you imagine, but it's going to happen. Okay? That's going to happen. So if we know that, we see that train coming. The other thing that we know is going to happen when that day comes, and there is a leak to the press about, oh my goodness, he's got the capability. Not just to hit my state. Unfortunately, we're going to be in the line of fire way earlier than anyone else. But let's say Chicago. Kim Jong-un can press a button and nuke Chicago. When that day happens, that's going to be all over the media. That's going to be front page, blaring headlines. You guys all know how this works. And there is going to be enormous pressure on who's ever in the White House to, quote, do something about it. We can't afford to allow this to happen. Do something, Mr. President or Madam President. That's going to happen. We know it. You guys know it. You've seen this before. So on that day, I think the American people and the media are also going to look at policymakers. They're going to look at the generals at the Pentagon. They're going to look at the White House. They're certainly going to look at Congress. and they're going to ask 3 critical questions. Are we safe? Did we see this coming? Have we been doing anything about it? And if so, what? And I think we need to start working right now to answer those questions and to be able to say, yes, we are safe. Yes, we saw this coming. And yes, we have the world's most robust and capable missile defense system that will, with near certainty, shoot down any North Korean missile and give our president strategic time to think through what he or she has to do. I think that's our responsibility, and we need to start now. I think he or she, at that point, can also send a message to Kim Jong-un or whoever's there saying, if you try this, we have the capability to shoot down 1, 2, 3, 4 missiles with almost 100% certainty, and then we will massively, massively, massively retaliate against you. And even a guy who's a little bit unstable, you may have seen the Twitter war between my good friend and chairman of the Armed Services Committee and the Kim Jong-un regime recently. Even someone like that, I think, will be influenced to not do anything, given those odds. You won't hurt us, and then you're gone. We need to get there. So what I want to talk to you about today is that rapidly growing North Korean threat, a little bit about Alaska's role in our nation's missile defense, what we need to do more in terms of making a more robust missile defense, and then talking a little bit about the report being released today. Again, Tom and CSIS have done such a service, I think, to the country on digging into this and really providing, again, policy makers like myself, the knowledge and the information to get smart on issues that really, really impact not only our country, but our allies. So let me start with the North Korean threat. It's here. We know it. Kim Jong-un has publicly stated his goal to develop a nuclear-capable intercontinental ballistic missile that can strike the entire United States. And let's be clear, this is a man who starves his own citizens. There's inhumane labor camps, had his half-brother assassinated in a Malaysian airport. We do not want this individual to be the one who can hold American cities hostage. But that is indeed the trajectory that I think we're on. So think about some of these facts. Since assuming power, Kim Jong-un has conducted nearly 3 times as many missile tests and over twice as many nuclear tests as both his father and grandfather did in their 60-year reign. Think about that. Startling fact. And while there's been several missile test failures, there's also been notable successes, and they're clearly learning. Let me give you a couple examples there. On the nuclear side, the country's 5th test, Kim Jong-un's 3rd, had an estimated yield of 50 to 20 kilotons. That's approximately the size of the nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima. So what does this all mean? Why is he testing so often? He often fails more than he succeeds, and how is that different from his father and grandfather? In his testimony on Tuesday, the open testimony, General Hyten, the commander of U.S. Strategic Command, responded to a question that I asked, and he said, North Korea is going fast, test, fail. Test, fail, succeed. And they're learning, and you can see them learning, because that's the way you learn in the rocket business. That was our Stratcom commander just a couple days ago in testimony. I also asked him about the recent tests that North Korea conducted, and if you hear General Hyten talk about this, it sends a bit of a chill down your spine. The test that was conducted on February 11th of this year. He responded, the North Koreans launched a new solid medium-range ballistic missile, a new technology, a new North Korean capability. which can be rolled out and launched at a moment's notice. So that's the big, big, big advancement. Solid rocket fuel versus liquid rocket fuel. And again, that should concern all of us. That night, when he did that, almost like clockwork, in a moment's notice, North Korea tested yet another missile. So, and then they're doing it again in the meeting, the summit that President Trump is having it with Xi Jinping, which again shows you kind of the instability there. So, again, this week, General Robinson testified before the Armed Services Committee, actually just yesterday, that, quote, North Korea is on an unprecedented pace of strategic weapons testing, and our ability to provide actionable warning continues to diminish. So that's the NORTHCOM commander just yesterday. This threat is growing, and our president's first strike or left of launch options and his strategic decision space and time are becoming limited because of these advancements. And while I've focused on North Korea and will continue to, the U.S. must also not lose sight of evolving ballistic missile threats from Iran and truly troubling Russian and Chinese technology advancements in hypersonic and long-range cruise missiles. So what do we do? Well, first, it starts with bolstering our nation's missile defense. Here's what our missile defense looks like today, if you can see that. This graphic is from the report being released today, Missile Defense 2020, next steps for defending the homeland. Again, Tom, great work on this. I strongly suggest you read it in its entirety. It's only 120 pages of rocket science, complicated budget speak, and wonky 12-letter acronyms. So it's a super quick read. But in all seriousness, it's a great document, and I really appreciate the great work that went into it. So as you probably know, and I'll do a little bit of bragging here, Alaska plays a critical role in our nation's missile defense. I often talk about my state from a military perspective as constituting three pillars of our nation's national defense. We are the hub of air combat power for the Asia Pacific, and training. And you've been to Alaska, we have the best training probably in the world in Jay Park, airspace bigger than Florida. We're going to have, with F-35s coming there, over 100 combat-coded fifth-generation fighters, all kinds of strategic airlift, AWACS, you name it. We are critical because of our strategic location in terms of air power. We're also a platform for expeditionary forces, air combat brigade combat teams, 1st Stryker Brigade, numerous Air and Air National Guard units ready to deploy on a moment's notice. And we are the cornerstone of our nation's missile defense. So Alaska has 4 key missile sites that protect the United States. First at Fort Greely, that's home to the 40 ground-based missile interceptors by the end of this year that are overseen by the 49th Missile Defense Battalion. That is an Army Alaska National Guard unit. I love to brag about that. They have a great motto, the 300 protecting the 300 million. And they do a great job, 24/7. Matter of fact, I was at a Wounded Warrior event at the White House yesterday, and the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Milley, was there, and I was doing a little bragging about his Army National Guard troops in Alaska who protect the entire nation. So that's first and foremost. Second, we have Clear Air Force Base, which is the oldest missile warning site in North America, but is now the future home of an upgraded early warning radar and the first long-range discrimination radar system that will help protect us. And that's the current home of the 213th Space Warning Squadron. That's an Alaska Air Guard unit. So let's think about that. These are citizen soldiers literally protecting our nation. Third, we have Eric's Air Station, way out on the tip of the Aleutian chain. on Shimei Island. That's the current home to the critical but rather old L-band Cobra Dane. Thankfully for the Alaska National Guard members, no one's assigned out there, pretty far away from home. It's just contractors. And finally, and probably less well known, there will soon be a 4th missile defense site in Alaska, located at the Pacific Spaceport Complex on Kodiak Island, where the Missile Defense Agency will begin conducting testing of the THAAD missile system. So the one that's currently being deployed to South Korea, safeguarding our service members in that part of the world. So we're proud in Alaska to have all these important components of our nation's missile defense. So just yesterday, talking about that missile defense, General Robinson testified that she has, quote, high confidence that the current system can defeat today's threats. Today's threats. But as you know, today's threats are not tomorrow's threats, and they're moving fast. So as noted, the threat from North Korea is rapidly increasing. Our nation's military leaders have regularly testified to that fact. And I think it's time we're finally starting to listen. Thankfully, President Trump is starting to listen, and his team is listening. He recently ordered a, quote, missile defense review to identify ways of strengthening missile defense capabilities, rebalancing homeland and theater defense priorities, and highlighting priority funding areas, unquote, which is another reason the great work of CSIS is so timely, because the President and his team are looking at that as well. And if you saw Senator McCain's overview of how he thought we should be focused on upgrading our military, he has an entire section on missile defense as well. So that review from the President's team is likely to come out later this year. So starting today, how do we build up our nation's missile defense? How do we begin to outpace the threats instead of chasing them? What should be included in the President's review? Here are 5 ideas I want to leave with you. First, we must stay the course in modernizing the GBI fleet and ensuring its reliability. This means investing in redesigned kill vehicles, or RKVs, which will be a more reliable, lethal, and cost-effective means to intercept enemy warheads, and investing in the multiple object kill vehicle and other advanced technology. It means investing in selectable 2- or 3-stage boosters to give our warfighters more battle space to successfully intercept enemy warheads, and it means continuing investments in command and control and ground-based sensors like LRDR. Now, thankfully, a lot of these items are currently on track and programmed into the budget because of bipartisan support in the House and Senate. Yes, you heard the word. Bipartisan support, Republicans and Democrats working together. If you look at the area of missile defense, you'll see a lot of bipartisan support. Even in tight budget environments, we've had a way of getting consensus on increasing the size of the Interceptor fleet, funding the construction of the LRDR at Clear Air Force Base, as I mentioned, is happening right now, and continuing to make at least some investments in advanced missile defense technology. But in my view, we need to do a lot more. So that's first. Second, we need to look to advancing our sensor capability, specifically with space-based sensors in the future. If we are ever to have a persistent, truly birth-to-death tracking of incoming enemy threats, space is the key answer. And you hear this in open testimony from all the military leadership in the country right now, particularly General Haidt. We need to develop an integrated layer of space-based missile defense sensors, and we need to start it now. Not only will this type of space-based system benefit homeland defense, it will also benefit and help integrate with regard to missile defense systems like THAAD, Patriot, and Aegis. So that's why that's so key. Third, while we work on these first 2 priorities, we need to dramatically increase our interceptor capability. I believe up to 100 ground-based interceptors. An April 2015 report by Johns Hopkins University found that North Korea could have as many as 100 nuclear warheads by 2020. Think about that. By the end of this year, we will only have 44 interceptors total. And then we're going to be launching a few more in the next few years for testing, and we're going to have less than 44. So that math doesn't quite add up. And as many in this room already know, Fort Greely was originally designed for at least 100 GBIs. So we clearly have the capacity right now. And Admiral Gortney, when he was testifying last year as the head of NORTHCOM, stated 44 GBIs will, quote, not be enough because it's not going to outpace the threat in the number that can be shot at us as we project into the future. With that in mind, I believe it would be wise to make infrastructure investments and build the future GBI silos as we are also doing the investment and the research necessary to accelerate RKVs and more sophisticated sensors. It would also be prudent to buy boosters on which the RKV will eventually be placed. These two investments would help ensure that when the RKV is declared operational, we will have everything we need to expand our ground-based interceptor capacity. It's also consistent with the priorities that General Hyten has laid out in his testimony: RKVs, sensors, and GBI capacity. But we can do these simultaneously. I think we have to, not sequentially, because time is not really on our side. Additionally, assuming a successful intercept later this year, and if it's technically feasible, it might also be a good idea to look into block buying an additional 20 interceptors to fill out Fort Greely's Missile Field 1 and stockpile operational and testing GBI spares. Also, we need to consider building an East Coast missile defense site, but not before we first explore a more near-term option like road mobile GBIs, and as you know, in the law, we're looking at LRDR capacity on the East Coast. Fourth, and importantly, we need to change the culture around missile defense testing. Currently, we have a testing culture that fears failure. And when you are afraid to fail, it is challenging to quickly develop new technology. For instance, North Korea's missile and nuclear programs are advancing rapidly because they are clearly no longer afraid to fail. In the same hearing this past week that I mentioned, General Hyten had this to say about the fear of failure. He said Wernher von Braun had a 60% failure rate. He was the greatest rocket scientist of all time. Can you imagine if we had a 60% failure rate, what the newspapers would say, or for that matter, Congress? In reality, we should be asking was that a successful test? Did we learn what we needed to do to advance the system? Are we advancing fast enough because North Korea is going fast? That's how we should be thinking about this. Ironically, our testing culture is somewhat similar to what North Korea previously had around its missile and nuclear programs. Now, like everybody here, I want every test to be a success. However, if we ever want to outpace the threat, we have to relearn how to fail. Accepting failure is the only way we can ultimately succeed. So along these lines, I worked again in bipartisan fashion last year with Senator Joe Donnelly to include an amendment in the FY 2017 NDAA to require the Missile Defense Agency to flight test our homeland missile defense at least once a year. These are the kind of things where Congress is pushing so we can get that culture of testing and learning. It was our belief, and it's now the law, that we should, as a country, more regularly conduct flight tests of our missile defenses. People too often forget about the men and women who protect us every day. I try to mention who they are to you this morning. A lot of Alaskans, a lot of citizen soldiers. Regular testing not only improves our system, it gives our warfighters reliance, confidence, and high morale. And it demonstrates to our adversaries that if they launch against the United States, their attacks will never reach our shores, ever. And that's the key. And finally, the fifth thing that we need to focus on, as always, is we need to look at doing all of this with our allies. And we have a lot of allies in this world. Israel, Japan, Korea, Poland. I like to say that we are an ally-rich nation, and our adversaries or potential adversaries are ally poor. And it's probably the most important strategic advantage we have right now in a very challenging world. Just look around the world. China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Nobody wants to be on that team. We have allies that we've been building for decades, if not centuries, in the Asia Pacific, in Europe. And like all issues, we need to be working closely with them to deepen our trust among each other and this incredibly important strategic comparative advantage that we have over any other country. So let me conclude by talking briefly about the CSIS report that's being released today. It does a great job of tracing all the high points and low points in the construction of our nation's homeland defense. The process to get here has not been easy, and the report makes that clear. As Tom puts in his report, it has been a, quote, trend of high ambition followed by increasing modesty, unquote. The high ambition has largely been driven by the evolving severity of the threats, while the increasing modesty has largely been a function of declining budgets. In fact, from 2006 to 2016, the MDA's budget declined nearly 25%. During the same period, Homeland Missile Defense declined nearly 50%, and Homeland Missile Defense testing declined 83.5%. Meanwhile, as the CSIS graphic shows, North Korea continues to test its systems at an alarming pace. Last year, I had the opportunity to lead a CODEL with some of my Senate colleagues to North Korea, Myanmar, and then to the Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore with many of the defense and military leaders in the Asia Pacific. When we arrived in South Korea, we, like most CODELs, had a great briefing from our commander there, General Brooks. We observed the proximity of the threat as we toured the DMZ. We saw what the South Koreans see as a threat every day. Yet since the armistice was signed on July 27, 1953, we as Americans, unlike the South Koreans, have been geographically protected from North Korea by a great distance and a large ocean. But that's changing as North Korea has been developing its ballistic missile and nuclear programs, and that great distance is shrinking. We responded in 2004 when MDA first declared its limited defense operations for Fort Greely. We had 5 GBIs then. We as Americans were once again, quote, safe or safer. But the threat, as I mentioned, is rapidly advancing, and I believe we are becoming exposed again. Unless we continue to invest in missile defense and change our thinking on testing, unless we choose to outpace instead of chase the threat, we as Americans might be forced to view Kim Jong-un's rantings as more than mere words. Let me conclude by giving you one anecdote that was very, very powerful for me. On this trip, you may have read about recently a very, very high-level North Korean defector who had come to South Korea, and that's all been made public. On this trip, which was last spring, we had read that this Korean defector had just come down to the South, the highest level defector yet, and we had requested a meeting with them, which we received. And it was quite an unusual meeting. This defector ball cap, sunglasses, 2 minders sitting right next to him, allowing him to say or not say answers, respond to the questions that Senator Gardner and Senator Ernst and I were asking him. 2 questions that I asked him stood out very kind of starkly, because it just showed you how we sometimes talk past each other and how the mindset of someone who grew up in North Korea and was a leader in the system was just so different from ours. The first question I asked them is trying to understand the sense of the security apparatus in that country. I asked them, what would happen if there was a young man, say 22, 23 years old, who went to the public square downtown Pyongyang with a bullhorn and a sign that was declaring Kim Jong-un was a, and then I used several kind of unkind words about the current leader. If someone was there just protesting in the town square, so what would happen to that guy? So, this gets translated, and the defector kind of looks at me strangely, tilts his head, and he responds very quickly. And the answer was, that man does not exist in North Korea. It's kind of an interesting way to look at it. And then I asked him the next question. I said, if there were a way the United States could absolutely, fundamentally secure and guarantee the security of the North Korean regime, would Kim Jong-un and the leadership in the North Korean regime give up its nuclear weapons and ballistic missile capability? So this gets translated. And then again, he kind of cocked his head. I think he must have thought I was the idiot in the room, because he was looking at me again like, oh, that's a dumb question. And I got the response from the interpreter. And he just looked at me, and the answer again was very simple. And he said, there can be no security for North Korea without nuclear weapons. That was his answer. So it gives you a little bit of an insight of how the leadership there thinks. And I'm here to say that in the face of growing threats from North Korea, I think there's going to be less and less security for the United States without a much more robust, increased missile defense for our nation. And we look forward to working with all of you and all the experts in this room and CSIS and others on helping us make sure we're able to achieve that. Thank you very much.
Well, Senator, you have time for a couple questions?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I wanted to follow up in the first instance on one of the things you hit early on, and that was the bipartisan character. And I wonder if you might kind of describe just sort of the tone, the conversation in the Senate about sort of the North Korea temperature taking, but then also kind of about the missile defense and other things in response.
Well, I think like if you came to an armed services hearing, it's a great question, but just yesterday, this past week, we obviously were focused a lot with General Robinson, with General Hyten testifying, 3 different hearings. But if you were dropped into one of those hearings and you didn't know that the Dems and the Republicans kind of lined up in the hearing on different sides of the dais, in many ways I think it would be difficult to tell who's who. So you see senators like Senator King, Senator Peters, Senator Donnelly, very strong on missile defense, always asking questions. And then, on the Republican side, Senator Cruz, myself, Senator Cotton, also very focused on missile defense. So In the committee, it's like that. I'll give you an even more kind of striking example. I led a letter to President Trump that came out about 4 or 5 days ago before his visit with Xi Jinping with Senator Cardin. And it was all about, hey, we think you're doing a good job on emphasizing the deployment of THAAD, but please make sure that this gets put on the agenda with the Chinese leadership in your meetings down in Florida. So we sent this around. I was not 100% sure who, if any senators were interested, how many, who. If you look at this letter, this has to be the biggest amalgamation of strange bedfellows in U.S. Senate history. It's everybody from some of the most conservative to some of the most liberal senators in the United States Senate. We had 30 senators who signed this letter. And I think it just gives you a sense, and it was really about half and half, Democrats and Republicans. So I think it just gives you a sense that on this issue, there is a lot of bipartisan support, primarily because senators read the paper, they go to the briefings, they go to the hearings, and they see essentially the theme of what I talked about, an increasing threat that we know is coming. We know it's coming. And I believe strongly it's our job to address it now.
Well, I was actually just going to mention in that letter, you, if I'm not mistaken, encouraged the president to really stand up to China. They've expressed a lot of dissatisfaction with that deployment. I wonder if you might kind of talk about that has analogs in Europe, it has analogs for homeland defense as well. How, China and Russia say they don't like this stuff for various reasons.
Yeah.
Your thoughts on that?
Well, the reasons are various, and they're also, I think we should be skeptical of kind of the kind of stated reason. Clearly, and I've mentioned this to my or to counterparts when I've met with Chinese officials, the United States clearly has the right to defend our troops and our allies. And I certainly hope and I anticipate President Trump in his meetings today is going to talk to President Xi Jinping about the threat and about the need for them meaning China, to do more to influence North Korea's extremely erratic and dangerous behavior. But we have every reason and right in the world to be able to protect our soldiers who are in the region, whether in Korea or in Japan or in Guam, and our allies in the region. And that goes for the Asia Pacific, and that goes for Europe. And I think that the Chinese know that this is not targeted at them. We say that publicly, we say that privately. One of the things that I think was an important signal right at the beginning of the incoming Trump administration was that General Mattis, Secretary Mattis, took his first trip as the Secretary of Defense, not to the Middle East, not to NATO, but to the Asia Pacific, specifically to Korea and Japan. And you may have seen the press on this, but he was very forceful in both countries on how we're going to deploy this. This is not meant to threaten China in any way, but we have every right in the world to defend our troops and our allies, and that's what the THAAD is all about. So, again, I think there's bipartisan support, as evidenced by the letter that we drafted and sent around and then sent to President Trump on the importance of raising this, and I anticipate that he will.
Great. Well, you've really covered the waterfront, so I think we might just open up to questions here. If you want to raise your hand and wait for the microphone, identify yourself, and keep your question in the interrogative tense. Why don't we start with this gentleman right here, and then we'll move to the middle.
Thank you. Hi, Sandy Clark. I'm a retired Navy guy. Last night we saw 59 cruise missiles land in Syria. old, mature technology. They work. There's value to having technology that works and keeping it over a long period of time. Question is, with regard to North Korea and given the immediacy of the threat, does it make sense to you to support the existing technology we have with regard to kill vehicles and that sort of stuff, and not launch off into some wild, exotic kill vehicle technology? Will you, from a budgetary standpoint, support?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a really important question. It was kind of what I was trying to get at the wrap-up of my remarks, which is we don't want to leave a gap in how we're trying to move forward with our missile defense. So what does that mean? I mentioned the notion that when you look at sensors, when you look at the kill vehicles, we clearly need to do more, and we need to advance, and we need to advance the technology. But what we shouldn't do is say, okay, everything's frozen right now until we perfect the technology that enable us to field more advanced kill vehicles or sensors. Because then you're not just treading water. In some ways, you're going backwards because the threat is still advancing. So I think we need to look at doing this from a kind of almost a simultaneous way. Increase the capacity, which we clearly need more of, in my view, while at the same time making sure that capacity has the capability to incorporate the new technology when it comes online and when it becomes available. So essentially walking and chewing gum at the same time with regard to missile defense. But sometimes I think in the Congress and even over at the Pentagon, there's this notion of, okay, we have a system now, we're not going to do anything with it until we get a much more advanced system, and we're doing the technological research to get there, but we're not going to do anything in between. And I don't think that's acceptable, and that's one of the reasons. And I'm pretty sure General Hyten is in the same category. The key is convincing my colleagues, because of course this will cost money, but my view is, boy, talk about a insurance policy that most Americans, if they were aware of what was happening, would be glad to pay for. This is that kind of insurance policy. The premium in terms of continuing to develop capacity and technology is a very small down payment for that day that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, which we all know is going to come, where we can look out at the American people and say, we got your back. We saw this coming. You are protected. And I think it's really our responsibility to do that.
Good. Okay. John, right here in the middle.
Thank you. John Harper with National Defense Magazine. You know, there's been a lot of rhetorical support for increasing spending on missile defense and boosting capabilities in this town for a number of years.
Yeah.
But as you noted, Senator, the Missile Defense Agency's budget has actually been in decline for a while. So do you think that we're actually going to see increased appropriations for missile defense, and will that trend actually be reversed, or do you think we'll just keep going along saying, yes, missile defense is good, but we're not going to fund it?
I do think we will see it, but it's a great question, and I certainly can't be sure. But the reasons I think that we will is, as we were talking earlier, there is strong bipartisan support, and we're working on a bill that we're likely going to introduce in the next month that has a number of the things that I talked about, and we're going to try and get a number of Democrats and Republicans on board with that. So there's already bipartisan support. There's the threat is clearly increasing, and we all know that. And I think our constituents, the people we serve, are starting to see that and wake up to it. For so long, the nuclear threat from North Korea has always been viewed as a regional threat. Korea, Japan, okay, we know it's a problem. Yes, Japan and Korea are key allies. We have troops over there, but it really doesn't impact my daily life when I'm going to work in Chicago or Sioux City. Again, I think that's going to change at some point, and we need to be ready for it. So And then I think that we're going to see a White House that's more supportive. You know, with all due respect to President Obama's administration, they came in and thought missile defense was some kind of starry-eyed program that didn't deserve the money. You know what happened during the early years of the Obama administration. All of that funding got cut. And then I think after too many briefings in the Oval Office for the president on the North Korean threat, you start to see, uh-oh, holy cow, this is serious. And so even they started increasing. So I think the trend lines at least have bottomed out and are coming back. So I'm confident, and as you probably can tell, I'll be somebody pushing this. But I do think there's going to be bipartisan support to do it.
There was a couple more in the back there.
Morning, Senator. John Hammer, Center for Naval Analyses. Thanks very much for sharing your insights with us. I was wondering, do you have any views on the potential role of Aegis BMD and Aegis Assure in homeland defense or to protect our regional allies?
Well, John, let me, it's a great question, and I'm somebody who believes in when you're a public official and you're a little bit over your skis, that you don't try and BS, you try to recognize that you might be over your skis. What I do know is that kind of the integrated layer approach with Aegis, with THAAD, with what we have back home is really important. That's why I talked about space-based sensors as a way to help kind of have persistent surveillance that can help all of our different missile defense capabilities and more fully integrate them. But with regard to the technological aspects of how that's done, I think I'm much better and safer to leave that to the next panel. But it's a great question.
Good. Just right here at the front.
Dan Wasserberly with Janes. So you mentioned that the DPRK defector told you that North Korea could have no security without nuclear weapons. So I'm curious, would you support a sort of agreement to freeze their nuke program where it is today? Or do you think the approach should be to roll it back entirely to no nukes whatsoever, no missiles?
I don't support having a perpetually nuclear North Korea given the instability of the leadership there.
All right. Quick one right here in the second row here.
And remember, just the question was security for the regime if you fully, completely de-nuke yourself. And he just didn't get the question because I think in their mind, that's a 2 + 2 = 5 equation that doesn't compute to them. It was very clear to me. He kind of looked at me like I was asking a stupid question. And maybe from their perspective, I was. Wasn't stupid from my perspective, though.
I'm General Abramson. I had the privilege of being President Reagan's first SDI director.
Oh.
And I'd first like to say that
Well, thank you for that.
great privilege, and I think it's due to all the people in this room, to the kind of policy support, congressional support, all of that, that we're where we are today. And it's very gratifying to see that. When you talk about the North Korean threat, many times we spend the time, as you have, very properly, by the way, to outline just what that threat could look like from that small nation, which we can get a fair amount of outside sensor-based information from. But isn't there another aspect of the threat where they begin to sell this?
Yes.
Because they have absolutely no cash crop there, but nuclear weapons would immediately put money in the leadership's pocket. And when that goes, then it won't be as observable, and the threat will be much broader.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. And by the way, thank you for your work under President Reagan. But that's another reason why I would view a freeze as completely unacceptable for the very reason that you mentioned. They have the scientists, they have the capability, and let's face it, they have the history of doing exactly what you just mentioned, which is trying to sell their technology and expertise to gain revenue. And I think they almost certainly will continue to try and do that. They're probably trying to do that as we speak. So it's another element of this threat, which is, it's certainly a conundrum. I'm not up here saying I have all the answers, but a stronger missile defense certainly is one of them, and a more engaged China is another element, and hopefully we'll see some progress on that issue today at the summit between the two presidents.
Well, Senator, I know your time is tight here, but I did want to follow up with one additional thing.
Sure.
You mentioned the 300, defending the 300 million.
Yeah.
We've been up to Fort Greely. It's pretty remote. Is there any sort of thoughts or recommendations you might have to help out the warfighter at Greely or elsewhere for that matter?
Well, look, like I said, I'm just very proud of that unit, right? It's not often, those guys and women are 24/7. Christmas Day, you go out there, they're working it, protecting all of us. And it is a, bit of a remote part of the state. It gets cold there. We had a cold winter in the interior. For those of you who've been up to Fort Greely, getting down to 40 and 50 below zero is not uncommon. So you got to be tough. I was able, working with it wasn't an earmark, but to get some upgrades to their gym and some of their facilities on the base to take care of those men and women who are doing a great job. But, I think one of the things that's important is, which is why I try to do it, I do it on the committee. Heck, I did it with General Milley yesterday, I did it with all you guys today, is to, just do the shout out to them, right? Let them know that you know what they're doing. Because most men and women join the military. I'm still a reservist. As a matter of fact, I'm spending my research down a lot of my recess. I'm going to be down at Camp Lejeune doing my Marine Corps Reserve training. Got to go get a haircut tomorrow, make sure this mop top. I could not show up in a Marine Corps uniform with this very long hair here. But to just acknowledge, to those men and women that you know what they're up to, you know how important it is to the country, you appreciate their service, and the 24/7 element of that is really important. So I think, and then of course we got to fund them and let them know that you can talk all you want, but if the facilities are decrepit and there's no place to spend your time constructively when you have off time, that speaks volumes too. But you guys, I know, all do that. And what I try to do in my capacity is remind others that we should be proud of these young men and women because they're doing a great job.
Well, I know you have to run back to the Hill, but thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks for all the work.
And I just want to invite folks to go get a cup of coffee, and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes, and we'll have our panel to talk about the report and have a little discussion. Thank you.
Jim Miller, President of Adaptive Strategies. I've had an involvement with missile defense over a number of decades, starting on Capitol Hill House Armed Services Committee in the late 80s, early 90s, and continuing on through my time, including as Undersecretary of Defense in the Obama administration. We have a great panel here today. You've already met Tom Carrico, who is Senior Fellow here in the International Security Program at CSIS, Director of the Missile Defense Program. And Tom will talk about, in particular, his report, Missile Defense 2020 Next Steps for Defending the Homeland. Dr. Laura Grego, thank you for being here today as well. Laura is a senior scientist in the Global Security Program for the Union of Concerned Scientists, and also has a recent report entitled Shielded from Oversight, the Disastrous U.S. Approach to Strategic Missile Defense. And we'll speak to that and a number of other issues, I think. And our third panelist today, Major General retired Fran Vaughn, among other assignments, his last posting was the J5 Director of Strategy, Plans and Policy for NORAD in NORTHCOM, and then also headed up several commands for Army missile and air defense, and at one point was Director of Test for the Missile Defense Agency as well. So it's a great group, and I want to thank you, General, especially for coming to pinch hit for Keith Englander from the Missile Defense Agency, who was unable to be here today due to a schedule conflict. So I just want to say a couple of words to kick off, and then we'll turn to the panelists today. And indeed, as was mentioned earlier by Senator Sullivan, Trump administration is kicking off a major review of U.S. ballistic missile defense posture and policy. If we harken back to the 2010 Missile Defense Review conducted by the last administration, I think it's notable that it placed defense of the U.S. homeland as the #1 priority for missile defense. Our allies and partners can contribute to theater missile defense for defense of their own key assets and population, indeed to support our forward deployed forces. No one else will do the job or should do the job of defending the United States for us. It also made clear, the prior review of the Obama administration, that our missile defense system is aimed at North Korea and Iran, and that it is not intended to affect strategic stability vis-a-vis Russia or China. One of the recommendations in Tom's report would say shift that focus a little bit and include as a goal the ability to engage ballistic missiles in very limited numbers from Russia or China, and we'll want to talk about that issue and any potential implications for stability. But clearly, as we think about missile defense today, the driving consideration is North Korea's continued missile testing, its continued efforts on its nuclear program, and the reality that while North Korea poses an uncertain threat to the United States homeland today, it does pose a threat even today, and that threat is likely to grow in the coming months and years. Missile defense is not the only part of the U.S. approach to that problem and to our allies' approach, but it's got to be a fundamental part. Currently, a lot of qualitative improvements underway in the system. I give great credit to Missile Defense Agency Director Jim Searing, Vice Admiral Jim Searing, for pushing these along, including for modified kill vehicle, for improvements to command and control, BMC cubed, and to sensors as well. A lot of work underway. One of the questions we'll want to discuss is whether the pace is appropriate on the qualitative side and whether there are any places that are being missed. And of course, we'll want to discuss, as we get into the panel, whether we should be looking today to grow the system beyond the current 44 ground-based interceptors that are deployed and that we would like ready for operations as necessary. So these will be among the issues we discussed. They'll be among the issues that the new administration's Missile Defense Review will have to discuss. And I think we'll get a good start today. We'll start with Tom.
All right, well, good morning. So I'm Tom Carrico. I want to also thank Jim and the other panelists for joining, but also to, again, thank Senator Sullivan for coming out this morning. And as Jim mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of the report of Missile Defense 2020. And on the basis of both the NDAA and presidential directive, as Jim mentioned, the administration will be looking at missile defense policy, posture, and strategy and also by explicit presidential direction, the relative balance between homeland and regional. And every month or so, North Korea lately seems to be doing something new in terms of missile development, and there's other new threats out there as well. And I think that given the circumstances we find ourselves in, I would not be surprised to see a relative rebalancing in the near term in favor of homeland, at least relative to where we've been in recent years. And we kind of hope that this report lays out a menu of options or a kind of a roadmap for how one might do that. And before I get started, I really want to acknowledge a couple folks, including my co-authors, Ian Williams and Wes Rumba, who are both here, who put a lot of work into this effort. I also want to thank the many smart people in and out of government who let us bend their ear about this. It's been going on, our research here, for a while. Also those at Fort Greely who kindly gave us their time. And finally to the CSIS Ideas Lab, and particularly Carolyn Amenabar, who put together, I think, some great graphics that helped to communicate some of this stuff. So let me say that, one of the reasons we wanted to put this report together was that I think that the conversation about homeland missile defenses remain, unfortunately, too polarized and generally underinformed or misinformed. To some extent, that's pretty understandable. It's hard to keep track of all the different kinds of kill vehicles and all the different things in development. GBI math has its own rules as well. So one of our secondary purposes here is to kind of serve as a compilation, maybe a guide for the perplexed on all the kind of complexity, bring stuff together in one place. But I think the problem with how this is frequently discussed runs a little bit deeper, including with a lot of historical baggage that unfortunately tends to confuse the debate. And I think with respect to homeland missile defense in particular, the discussion is too frequently divided between, on the one hand, cheerleaders, who I don't think take sufficient account of the difficulties of some of the things, and on the other side, kind of folks snickering or deriding. I think that both a better understanding of the past and the current program of record might help mollify some of that. So the report really tries to do three things. First, as I said, to bring together a bunch of information in one place, kind of a reference guide of where things have been. Second, lay out a menu of options for what might be considered and look at the limits and benefits of a lot of those. And third, make some of our own findings and recommendations. And so as not to bury the lead, I'll just say that I think that the current program, both GMD and related systems, need a range of reliability, capability, and capacity improvements relative to where we are today. And as well, I think some policy and budgetary adjustments would be in order in the forthcoming MDR. So there's been a lot of back and forth, policy-wise and programmatic-wise, over the last 20 years or so. And in the report, we deliberately try to highlight and emphasize the continuity. On the one hand, the strategic continuity, but also the programmatic continuity. On the strategic side, I think go back and read President Clinton's speech in 2000, the one where he said he was not going to decide to deploy national missile defense. And then look at the speech that President George W. Bush gave in 2001 announcing the withdrawal from the ABM treaty. And I think actually there's a lot of continuity there in terms of not necessarily the exact assessment of the technological readiness, but in terms of the strategic rationale. The idea being very simply that we're not unwilling to accept complete vulnerability to certain kinds of threats. We're unwilling to really accept and risk deterrence failure with respect to certain kinds of actors like North Korea. And on the programmatic side, I think appreciating the lineage and evolution of today's program is also important, looking at really the roots of GMD and NMD, for instance. I also think one can't really appreciate some of the reliability issues of the EKVs and silos today if you don't appreciate that in many respects they are still the advanced prototype design put together in the 1990s under ABM treaty restrictions. And that furthermore, that the 2002 decision to field a limited defense capability in 2 years left little choice but to embrace a kill vehicle still under development, and furthermore, to adapt a lot of legacy Cold War systems that had not been designed for this in short order and put them to use. And so ever since then, we're still, I think, kind of waiting a true design turn on the kill vehicle, but instead have been kind of life extending the program in different ways. And I'll say I think the conversation as a result of some of these things suffers from a kind of unfortunate and maybe even weird dynamic. An old dichotomy tends to get embraced. The dichotomy that regional missile defense is good and effective, but homeland missile defense is bad. And the perception extends beyond the particular systems to the mission itself. Regional missile defense is effective, so goes the argument, but you can take it as an article of faith that homeland missile defense is impossible. And I'll say on the other side, that the cheerleaders who do not sufficiently, I think, acknowledge some of the issues out there don't do the issue justice either. So what we try to do is to kind of be fair and candid in both directions. That means we get criticized from both sides. So I'll just say there are a lot of shortcomings, but I think that the path forward you heard about this morning and that Jim mentioned just now about the RKV really is a good one. And that especially it begins to, that dichotomy I mentioned is important because the path forward is going to leverage a lot of that past testing, a lot of that past development that have been taking place in the regional systems and applying it forward. So that's commonalities between exoatmospheric kill vehicle on the one side and exoatmospheric kill vehicle on the other side. So let me start to walk through a little bit of this. Jim mentioned the BMDR, highlighting homeland missile defense as the top priority of U.S. missile defense efforts. This actually is just a general overview. That kind of exoatmospheric intercept is going to be taking place with an SM as well as an EKV. But this is the historical emphasis between homeland and regional, really going back to 1996. So it's fluctuated a lot. There was a big surge, especially for the capital investments for the deployment back in the 2002 to 4 time period. But this isn't just GMD, but it's kind of the overall emphasis, green being homeland and blue being regional. And for those of you taking pictures, we'll have all of these online for you so you can download them to your pleasure. And I also want to put this in a little bit historical perspective. This is, I think Senator Sullivan mentioned it, this is our relative modesty in terms of the number of interceptors we're talking about. If you look on the far right, that's 2017. That will be in the ground by the end of this year. But compare that, for instance, to the Clinton administration, the 3 phases of the Clinton administration, 100 to 250. Before that, kind of the GPALs, right, whose job it was to go after a limited threat of 10 to 100 RVs. And before that, kind of SDI Phase 1, Safeguard and Sentinel and that sort of thing. But in terms of the overall context, I think you really see that modesty. Sorry, I keep looking for the keyboard down here. And the other context here, another important context here, is the legislative environment. And this past year, Congress went back and updated the 1999 National Missile Defense Act, which, by the way, was 17 years old. And a few anachronisms were in there. First of all, we don't talk about national missile defense anymore in so many words. And this is talking in the future tense about, we ought to deploy we've done that. And so I think Congress correctly has gone in and really updated this. I think, unfortunately, there's been a lot of hyperventilating about the update that, to my way of thinking, proves that the schools do not teach sentence diagramming anymore. All the focus has been on the adjectives, like the word limited, but no one has, I think, sufficiently appreciated that it is a complete sentence, and that the subjects and objects of defense in that sentence have changed. It is no longer about merely national missile defense territory, but also, as you can read, allies and forces. And, the word limited may not apply in the same way that we used to think about it in 1999 or in sort of the GPALs kind of context. So I actually think you take a look at these adjectives and you compare them to the 2010 BMDR, and there's actually a lot of continuity. The overall budget top line, this goes back to 1985. SDIO, BIMDO, and MDA, you do see that surge with MDA with respect to the deployment in the 2004 timeframe. But just within the past 10 years, as we heard about this morning, and I hope you can see this, This is specifically the homeland elements that we've broken out. This is a kind of a falling tree graph. Those are the FIDEPs as well as the actual spending that you see there. And as we heard this morning, a 24% decline over the past decade for the top line, but then some deeper cuts for, and here we're going to go a little deeper now into GMD. And these are the various components of GMD. And really this goes out into the FIDEP, but the trend is pretty clear. I could show you about 50 graphs here. They're in the book, and they all kind of look like that. Now let me, missing my keyboard again. Let me walk through, we have a chapter on interceptor development, we have another chapter on sensors and that sort of thing. We're going to blow through a little bit of this. And let me just put up here the long view of interceptors, the lineage really of where we are today. One limitation of the GBI fleet today is it's a lot of different kinds of interceptors going on. It's also the case, and you can take a look at here at some of the CE2, C1, CE2s, relative, frankly, to other deployed systems today. Unfortunately, the CE2s don't have the on-demand communications to the ground, for instance, the EKVs of today. There's also, unfortunately, a shortcoming of the 3-stage booster. That the intention to go out and get a 2-stage booster was never done. And MDA is looking for a selectable way to get at that flexibility. But what that basically means is you're not able to buy more time and fire later. You're going to have to fire sooner because all 3 stages have to burn out before the kill vehicle can be released. And especially if you're operating from Alaska, that's going to limit you. Let me also move now to the MDA's 3 phases. This is kind of the current roadmap. The current roadmap for going forward. Enhanced, robust, and advanced is kind of their categories. But what it really is what we are this year, getting the 44 GBIs in the ground of the CE2s and the CE2 Block 1s. The second being really the centerpiece of the advanced homeland missile defense is the RKV, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Although RKV is not a dramatic departure, it is that kind of design turn that in some ways should have happened a decade ago, but never did. The good news is that they're not starting from scratch, and they're going back and leveraging a lot of the parallel work that's been going into other programs. But the idea is to make the EKV far simpler, cheaper, more modular, and have fewer points of failure. These are the kinds of reliability issues that have come up again and again. And getting to that RKV will also reduce kind of the diversity in the fleet. And I'll show in a chart just a minute, it just shows how many different types are in today's GBI fleet. The RKV in particular will draw the seeker, kind of the telescope, and a lot of discrimination algorithms that have been floating around there and all that good Aegis testing, and draw upon all that. So it's not going to be starting from scratch. And then further out in the future to the advanced section is the MLKV, which we heard about again this morning. That again is quite a bit far behind relative to where the plan was. Multiple kill vehicles atop a single booster to kind of compensate for some of the discrimination challenges and really improve your effective magazine capacity. Unfortunately, the timeline for the MLKV currently is kind of 2021 plus, and it's really pretty far out to the right in terms of that. This chart right here is actually kind of the centerpiece of what's going on and what the agency currently plans. We call this the Skittles chart. You can taste the rainbow and kind of see a lot of different muscle movements of what's happening there. The green at the bottom is the CE1. That's kind of the oldest kill vehicle that got put in place really back in 2004. The red is the CE2. The blue is kind of the CE2 plus or CE2 Block 1. And then the orange, and pay attention to that orange, that's the RKV. And that's supposed to come online kind of in the 2020 timeframe. Testing in 2018, potentially deployed 2020. Now, this, as I said, is kind of, I think, the best snapshot of what's going on and what's intended to be going on. We would point out a couple, we think, shortfalls of what MDA currently plans. One of them is what is likely to be, under current plans, a big gap between the things that are going to be put in place this year, the 44 by 17. After that, we're presumably sit and wait until the RKV comes around. That could have, excuse me, that could have costs later on. It could, especially if RKV goes to the right, it could kind of retard some of our efforts to increase capacity in the near term, and it might unfortunately hurt RKV later on. A second limitation is that, as we heard earlier, notwithstanding a recommendation in 2013 by the Department of Defense to go out and buy some operational and test spares, that wasn't done. And so after we get to 44, we're going to go down. And every time we test something, they have to pull one out of the ground to test it, and there's one less operational. And that kind of starts to add up until you begin to kind of get the next generation. That's kind of the current picture, and that's why I think that's one of the several reasons why you're hearing folks talk about the importance of capacity. To, instead of going down, go down, I think, by at least 4, if not more, just in the next couple years, and then before RKV comes online. And again, you know, the schedule that you've been hearing in 2020 for RKV, that could be too ambitious, right? And if that's too ambitious, then that reduction might be more important. And then the third limit is that, fortunately or unfortunately, MDA, I think, is planning to put the RKV on some of the oldest boosters, and that's perhaps for cost, and that might kind of reduce some of their effectiveness. Sorry about that. All right, so let's talk into testing. I'm sure we'll have a little bit of discussion about this right now. I want to walk especially through, first of all, just an instance of the testing budget. Now, there's some good reasons why the testing budget's gone down so much. They really had to go back post-2010 and really figure out, right, take apart the EKV, figure out that some of the problems, and then put it back together again. So some of this is kind of the overall top-line reduction pressure, and some of it has to do with that choice. But I think it really is the case that this is one of those, probably maybe the best instance of the mischaracterizations of the testing record of GMD overall is with the tests, with maybe that one exception that I mentioned that they went back and had to fix with the IMU. Most of these are not high technology problems, these are dumb problems. As everybody attests, it's kind of manufacturing stuff, it's the maybe workmanship or something like that, but it's not high technology. One of these failures is because of the silo cover not opening and the missile not coming out, you know? And that's the sort of thing that it's not about the kill vehicle, it's about that kind of difficulty. So I think MDA has, in the past couple of years, Vice Admiral Searing has, I think, been much more forthright about kind of articulating really these failures and the true causes of them. So sensors, you know, no missile defense system is better than the sensors that tell it where to go and what to kill. And it is, we have what we call the mother of all testing charts in here that not only kind of goes through the full 31 flight and intercept tests and what became of them, the failure explanations, things like that, but also what sensors were involved. And you really see from kind of the late 1990s to where we are today, a pretty consistent increase as more early warning radars are stitched in, as Aegis and other things are brought in, you see a lot more of that. And that, I think, is a good thing. There's probably a lot more to do on the sensor side. Probably the single most important thing that we recommend on the sensor side is a space-based, probably infrared tracking and discrimination sensors. You get that field of view from which you can inform not only GMD, birth to death, but also all these other programs as well. Overall, you know, Vice Admiral Searing has characterized the test record as a kind of, as nothing you wouldn't expect from a test bed for a prototype. And I think in sum, that really fits what we are. The key of where we need to go from here to the future is to get out of that test bed and to get out of that prototype and get to the RKV design term. This right here is just a quick picture of a lot of the sensors that have evolved over time, over decades, that are slowly coming online, and LRDR you'll see at the top is some of this. This is the sensor budget. Now, you know, some of these high-end capital investments don't need to be made on continued. But take a look at the bottom. These are broken down by category. The last category at the bottom is the space-based, and that's really what's kind of gone off the cliff. This is MDA's space-based budget overall, and you get the idea. Now, in terms of future options, we kind of put together a lot of the UAV-directed energy, some of the kind of boost phase concepts that have been circulating and continue to come back. The difficulty, of course, is that the budget's not there for them. We had another report last year kind of talking about the budget pressures, especially on MDA's R&D account. And you see here kind of the, what we call the R&D valley of death between about 2010 and onward. And admittedly, some of it's still potential, but that's the amount of mediocrity for MDA's R&D. Some good things going on, but I think in relative terms, MDA could probably be doing a lot more. And then let me just sort of run through briefly our recommendations. I'm not going to read them all. That's why we gave you the book. But I think in terms of the policy, I think we should continue to have a more robust and layered missile defense for a variety of threats against both ballistic and cruise missiles. Now, we mentioned that. That's actually part of the MDR report explicitly, and so it'll be interesting what they come up with. We don't go into a lot of programmatics. There frankly aren't a lot of programmatics to talk about on cruise missile defense just yet. On the budget side, restore homeland missile defense, I think, to a level commensurate with being the first priority. And within the budget, to prioritize RKV and look at accelerating MOKV and directed energy. In terms of interceptor capacity, continue the current course that MDA is doing, but look at accelerating MOKV as well. In terms of, that's capability. In terms of capacity, I would say continue to look at adding to the 44 or the 40 in the coming years and continue to grow that out. We heard about that this morning. Fort Greely has a lot of capacity. What we're really talking about here is activating the hedge that was described in, again, that 2013 DoD hedging strategy, activating the hedge, which was very explicit in that report. If you want to go and do that, growing out Fort Greely is the most cost-effective and nearest term solution to do that. Now, there's a lot of, I think, attention on kind of the East Coast site possibility. We encourage some more cost or less costly approaches to that. We don't want to exhaust the entire MDA budget on new capital improvements. And if there is a way to add some capability and add battle space with transportables or with some kind of underlay that supplements the coverage of the East Coast in terms of quality, that's probably a more cost-effective way to get at it. I think there's a lot of interest in that. You're going to hear more about it. But we get the idea of adding the capability, but there might be some cheaper ways to get there. And then in terms of sensors and testing, I think really the space-based sensor layer is the most important one there. And I'm going to leave it off there and turn it over to some other folks. Thank you.
Tom, thank you very much. Very nice presentation and a terrific report. Credit to yourself and to your team. Laura Grego, you're up next.
Okay. Hi, so thanks so much, Tom, and CSIS. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to participate in this panel. I expect I was invited because I co-authored a report last year on the Ground-based Midcourse Defense program, and it's a pretty detailed report. I'd be happy to give you a copy if you weren't able to get one. In the report, we were pretty tough on the GMD system. You can probably tell by the title. We were tough on Congress, we were tough on the Missile Defense Agency and the Bush and Obama administration's policies and stewardship, so I'll be straightforward about that. Our intent, though, was to spark detailed, engaged discussions about the role of strategic missile defense in our country. And I believe that these well-informed conversations are essential to U.S. security and to global security. We can't have an informed debate about the current value and the future potential of the GMD system and homeland missile defense without a clear-eyed assessment of it. So I also appreciate CSIS taking on this topic. Separating myth from truth is critically important when the topic is contentious, as strategic missile defenses, and Tom alluded to these long-standing debates. Since it's been almost 15 years and $40 billion sunk into the GMD system after its inception, we thought we'd take a look and see sort of where we are, what the capability is, how we got here, and what are lessons, if any, that we could learn from that. Our work was based substantially on the findings of the official US government sources. We drew heavily from the GAO, from the Pentagon's own testing office, the Director of Operational Test Evaluation. We essentially found the system is in worse shape than most people had realized, and I think that's an area of substantial agreement between our reports. And we tried to take a look at why we thought it ended up this way. And so we ended up looking a lot at the oversight and accountability system set up around the system. And we found that it undermined the GMD system's development. Rather than summarizing the whole report, I'm just going to make 3 short points that I think reflect the differences and agreements between our reports. I think, Tom, the first is we agree that the system is in pretty poor shape. Tom and his co-authors describe the GMD system as being in its adolescence, or essentially an advanced prototype, and notes that the system currently has some serious reliability issues. This is an area of substantial agreement between the both of us. I would note that in 9 of the 17 tests since 1999, the kill vehicle failed to destroy the target. And that record hasn't actually been improving over time, as you'd expect for a system that's maturing. So keep in mind also that the tests were essentially developmental in nature. So as Tom mentioned, sort of an advanced prototype testbed type of tests. They were conducted under simplified conditions, not operational conditions, which are certain to be much more challenging. Instead, in each test, the missile defenders, because of the nature of the test, had significant information about the time and place of the target's launch, how the target and other objects would look. And the conditions haven't varied all that much, and essentially I think we're set up for success. Just the way the CSIS report describes it is that it's difficult to assess whether these improvements have made the test as realistic as they could be. I actually think we have quite a bit more information about the operational realism of the test program. I mean, we have a specific office in the Pentagon to evaluate that. The DOT&E looks at the missile defense endeavor every year and provides advice on the testing program. And in 2014 released an in-depth assessment of the Ballistic Missile Defense System. And in that report, the chief testing official's assessment was that the tests to date are, quote, insufficient to demonstrate that an operationally useful defense capability exists. Some of the shortcomings, as we agree, it's yet to be tested against an ICBM range target, so we expect to see that later this year. Hasn't used a salvo of interceptors against a single target, or hasn't used salvo interceptors against a salvo of targets. Some of the conditions you'd expect the system to be facing in the real world, nor really against a complex set of complex countermeasures. So further, that DOT&E report says the reliability of the interceptors is low, and that the MDA continues discovering new failure modes during testing. So here's where we agree substantially with CSIS also that robust testing is critical. And we strongly agree with the recommendation for improving the realism and pace of the testing program. Testing not only helps reveal design and quality control issues, it also provides the information you need to assess the reliability in a quantitative way. So if the US plans to launch multiple interceptors at each target to make up some of the ground for the interceptors with low reliability, salvo launching actually only provides limited improvement unless the effectiveness of the interceptor is already high. So you need to know really clearly what the reliability of your interceptors are. And salvo launching doesn't help if there's a common mode failure, which needs to be discovered in testing. So the second point I wanted to make is why did this happen? And here's where we make some divergence from the CSIS report. In 2002, missile defense was brought under a different acquisition system, different and more flexible than most major defense acquisition programs. Those systems were set up to prevent premature and expensive fielding of unproven systems. Most people call it fly before you buy, maybe J5000. It moved into a special system which allowed engineering corners to be cut. It was also giving an unrealistic timeline for deployment, which essentially ensured those corners would be cut. And we found that that has had real and lasting consequences. We document that in depth in the report, but it certainly shows up in the CSIS report too. And we don't really see that the problems with the GMD system were due to the lack of budget. They're instead because the development has been driven by a schedule rather than technical readiness. And I think this has been fairly well accepted, even in circles less skeptical than mine. A key example is because missile defense is exempted from the obligations to fly before you buy that other, especially in the past, that other major defense programs are subject to, the Pentagon was able to field what were essentially untested prototypes. In fact, nearly every single GMD interceptor was fielded before having undergone a single successful intercept test. So as failure modes and flaws are discovered, the fixes had to be made to an already fielded set of interceptors. Or as we see in some cases, those fixes just didn't get done. I think this is a serious problem, especially when you're developing something as complicated as a GMD system. It's an enormous endeavor, one of the most complicated projects the Pentagon has ever taken on. We saw improvements to the missile defense acquisitions process at the end of the Bush administration and during the Obama administration, but they don't seem to be sufficient to the task of preventing reoccurrence of many of these problems. We continue to field interceptors, in some cases with known flaws based on imposed deadlines rather than their technical maturity. We still see tests being conducted under heavily controlled conditions, and which are not really rigorously evaluating the system under operational conditions. Poorly vetted projects are started only to be canceled later, wasting time and money that could be better spent. I see Congress exploiting this lack of accountability by adding into the strategic missile defense portfolio projects that have not been asked for by the Pentagon, such as a third continental interceptor site, or that have been repeatedly shown to be dead ends, such as space-based interceptors. This lack of rigor also allows wishful thinking about how well the system works to dominate discourse about it. In our report, we collected more than 30 quotations from defense officials over the last decade and a half in which they state that they're confident the system can currently protect the US from a missile attack, despite no testing evidence to support those assertions. I'm concerned about that because believing that it works better than it does can lead to riskier decision-making. It can reduce the incentive to vigorously pursue other, perhaps more effective approaches to the problem of ballistic missiles. If you think that you're defended, you may be less prone to engage in the very difficult negotiations that are necessary to slow or stop and push back the North Korean nuclear and missile programs. The third point I wanted to make is a recommendation for moving forward where we have certainly some overlap and some differences. I really appreciate the work in this report and really laying out a menu of options. I would have loved to see more analysis and pricing and prioritization to see which ones you think are further, since we have so many budgetary constraints for the foreseeable future. But given the analysis in our report, we don't see a reason that spending more money will buy us a way out of the problem without really making tough decisions. We've seen in 15 years under 2 administrations and under the most flexible acquisitions program you design, we still haven't got a working system. And I understand the desire to be more agile and efficient in acquisitions, and that is not my, I'm a technical person, I'm not an acquisitions person. So I see it from the outside, but I am concerned without due attention, we run the risk of repeating the same thing that we'd had, a $40 billion system that the DOT and ESS's right now has still not demonstrated real-world capability. I think that rather than holding onto this flexible approach, that we should be demanding the highest rigor and the highest accountability and really making tough choices. This issue is especially acute for a program such as strategic missile defense, which is highly politicized, has strong entrenched debates, but especially because we incur the financial and the strategic costs of deploying missile defenses, whether or not the system actually works, right? Not only complicating our decision making, but it provides, strategic missile defense provides an incentive for Russia and China to increase the capabilities and sizes of their nuclear arsenal. And the disincentive, again, for the US to engage as hard as it might diplomatically on the issue of North Korea. Those are costs that we bear, whether or not the system works. So while the CSIS report makes a number of interesting recommendations for technology paths that could be used to improve the US ability to defend the homeland. I'd come out really with caution that these ideas be vetted really strongly by a rigorous requirements and analysis of alternative process. We have the tools to do that. Congress should not be creating programs of record such as a third site or a space-based missile defense program. I especially find the space-based missile defense program problematic. This is one of the recommendations of this report, but I think at this point it's unwise and premature. We've had lots of good analysis and the highest advice about this subject. In 2012, the National Academy of Sciences published a congressionally mandated report about boost-based missile defense. It was asked, tell us what you think. And they concluded that the space-based options would cost 10 times as much as other basing options, and more than $300 billion for what they called an austere capability, and recommended the US government not spend a single dollar more on boost-based missile defense. I haven't seen any revolutionary technology that would change this assessment. So this is a prime example where the process, I think, is important to keep us from our worst impulses. Research and development is one thing, but putting interceptors in space, just even as research and development, would be the first time that anyone's placed a dedicated destructive weapon in space. That's a bridge we haven't crossed yet. And that sets a precedent that would make things more difficult for the US to keep space secure for the uses it finds beneficial: military, civilian, scientific, economic. And putting a test bed in space provides no defensive capability, and it actually provides no offensive capability in space that we don't already have. So I agree that we should be building more bridges between skeptics and boosters. And I would hope that both proponents and critics would welcome a dedication to rigor and real thoughtfulness and real hard decisions. It's a necessary, although not sufficient, step to develop working technology. And critics should welcome it as a process that keeps untested equipment out of the field. And it provides credible information about how it actually works and what its potential in the future is, which is essential to any debate about the value of the system. So that includes real hard testing. I think that a well-functioning oversight system also provides a reality check on the myths that accumulate around a politically charged effort such as Homeland Missile Defense. I'll leave it there.
Laura, thank you very much for that presentation. Fran, over to you.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here, and Tom, thank you to your team for all the great work they've done on these reports. I'm kind of the pinch hitter here for Keith Englander, I could come on down late yesterday, but I'm happy to be here because I think it's a very good topic and a very interesting topic. And if you know my background, I'm a little bit of an operator, I'm a little bit of a programmer, I was a little bit of a tester. And I've been around the system in air and missile defense for a long time. My comments are brief, okay? Some of them reinforce, some of them challenge what's been said, but I think the basis will be the dialogue we have when the questions start coming. The entire BMDS is a challenge. Challenge from a technology aspect, challenge from a battle space aspect, fighting across 15 time zones as a system, challenges from a fiscal aspect and advocacy and support. And priority has been given, has waxed and waned over time based on the distance of the threat. Theater clearly has always had the near-term threat. The homeland has not. But in 15 years, that's changed. And 9/11 significantly changed the attitude. It was get something sooner rather than later. And I won't say haste makes waste, but haste can force you to make decisions you'd rather not. It can force you to settle on a design or a technique you'd prefer not to commit to at this time. It can compel a decision that may limit your options in the future. And when faced with a decision point and national security, decisions get made. And we accept the limitations and the future constraints, and we'll have to work through them. And that's kind of where we are today. And Tom's paper talks about infancy and adolescence and teens, and are we an adult? Are we a mature adult? Just look at the sensor family that was on that chart. Here are the sensors
use them. Well, they weren't designed for the task we're being asked to do. Okay, so that patchwork of sensors has had to grow as we've had to grow a family of interceptors. You know, the variety of GBIs is large. If you ever saw the variety of components inside the GBIs, you'd say, my God, what a fruit salad this is, and that looks like a vegetable. Yes, the test record has been spotty. 4 consecutive successful tests before IOC. But you got to remember how you test and what you test and what are your attributes and criteria you're trying to verify. And we've had, you know, test failures since IOC, and we've had test success. You know, all tests, as I say, it's what are you pursuing? You set your objectives, you design your test to evaluate those objectives, you assess what happens, and then you determine, do I need to retest an objective? Have I found a flaw or a shortcoming I need to work on before I go to my next test for that objective? And the 2014 return to flight was a most challenging intercept test and a significant, valuable test to the agency. You know, you think of strides in theater BMD, you know, we've been here before. In the theater fight, we had technical challenges. We had setbacks, we had budget issues, and we had advocacy issues. I mean, how many people here, you know, in 1990 thought hit to kill was going to work? I'll tell you, there were a lot of people who didn't think it was going to work. But we endeavored. And hit to kill, I think, works, because now it's the basis of all our missile systems. Okay? Patriot PAC-1, not a term you hear very often. 1988, the first BMD capability, and it was mainly software. Okay? And it gave us the ability to track ballistic missiles. PAC-2, the missile, the interceptor designed to kill a theater ballistic missile. You know, we went to Desert Storm with two missiles. That's all there were in the fall of 1990. Okay? We can argue what happened in Desert Storm didn't happen in Desert Storm. It was kind of, you know, reverberated with me when 5 GBIs. Well, not much has changed. But what we learned in Desert Storm was valuable. And we went to Desert Storm with no TTP, with no doctrinal foundation. By 2003, on the eve of OIF, we'd gone through countless software, hardware upgrades, and we had the PAC-3 interceptor. We almost literally lost it at a JROC in fall of 2002 because it had failed to achieve one nuance in a KPP. And we got it through the JROC. You know, 70% of that KPP was good enough. And we went to OIF in March of 2003, not with 2 missiles, with a full quiver of 13. 13 big ones, 2 of them fully instrumented for test, taken off the range and sent forward. And so what I'm getting at is, you know, it's a long, hard road to get a capability to the field. And you can look at Aegis. Aegis has come massive strides. I don't know where Navy area is or Navy theater from my youth, but Aegis today has arrived. THAAD has arrived. Okay? All these programs had their ups and downs, funding, political challenges, and technology issues, but they all arrived to contribute to the ballistic missile defense system at theater. And I would argue, as the question was asked, I think the Aegis capability, when you harness it into the system with the TIPI-2, with the other sensors in C2BMC, we're starting to stretch that operational theater of war to the strategic level of war. But none of these have the global operating environment that GMD must operate in and deal with. The enormity of the battle space is staggering when you stop and think about it. And we cannot afford to walk away from GMD. We may be able to discipline the process that has gotten us here. I don't think we should say it's a traditional acquisition program or process. And we must not forget that it's not the only thing we can focus on. So we can't cease all effort in the theater and the regional, or cease all effort in air defense and focus solely on GMD, because our adversaries are not. Okay, they are advancing. Just look at North Korea. Longer range, sub-launch capability, solid fuel, mobile launch. Air, sea, land launched cruise missiles in the last year from one of our future adversaries potentially, okay? Unmanned aerial systems being used by conventional forces and unconventional forces. For GMD, I believe we need to improve our sensors and our comm links, create that tighter shot group for the EKV. I think, as the Senator laid out, we're on the right path. The RKV is critical. It will enhance our ability to improve the system. Sensors are critical. The tighter the shot group you can give me, the better likelihood I'm going to hit the object. And growing GBI fields or more GBIs, yeah, a more robust quiver would be good. The ability to be able to cycle rounds in and out of there so you can do modifications without loss of overall capacity is good. I'm not certain where the location should be. Increase depth at one of the two we have now, create a third. Because based on where those fields are and your sensor architecture, well, that affects how you can engage different threat aspects. Directed energy, yeah, that's nirvana. Okay. In 2004, as the deputy at Fort Bliss, the Air Defense Center, I received the task to deploy a counter-rocket artillery system in 1 year. We had no requirements documents. We were outside of the acquisition process. We had 365 days. I love directed energy. And all of those believers were in my office. Well, the reality was it wasn't going to get there in 365 days. And I'm still waiting, but we're making progress. But we met that requirement, and we deployed a system that was pretty ugly, pretty kludgy, and it's still in theater today doing its task. And we put it through test, and you know what? It was kind of like a D, I don't know whether it was a D plus or a C minus, but we ain't got nothing. Something's worth a lot. And it's still in theater and it's still performing today, and it's been improved. With respect to, the 5 points the Senator put out there, I think he's spot on. With respect to testing is important. It's an element of the systems engineering model, but you just can't say every 12 months we're going to take a test, because that would be a waste of resources. And testing is difficult. It's difficult to plan, it's difficult to structure, it's difficult to execute, especially in the GMD realm. You look at the battle space we're trying to replicate. Okay. You look at the places you can and cannot operate from. You look at the environmental constraints and restraints. I once had to negotiate the closing of international airspace during storm, a storm that had taken my airspace away because airliners were diverting into my airspace so I could get a GMD test off. Okay, so just stop and think about that. We ceased international air, and I was losing my window of test opportunity while I had ships, sensors, and everything strung out across the Pacific, taking a pounding in this bad weather. We ultimately got the approval, and we held international air traffic to allow us to execute our test. But we were down to about the last 15 minutes of our test window. Not simple. You build your test, you assess your criteria that you need to test, you execute your test, you evaluate your data, and then you say, did I validate? Did I invalidate? Have I found something new? And you reorganize and plan for your next test. You can't say every 12 months we're going to do a test. Now, the Integrated Master Test Plan lays out numerous tests that will get after different criteria, different attributes that we want to assess in the system. The challenge is I can't just reach out to 2021 and pull that test forward and execute it in 2018, because there's a whole litany of pre-planning and pre-test simulation that had to be done before I could get there. There are targets that have to be built, and some of these targets are one-off or one of a kind. So you just, although we've developed a test plan, and that test plan is out there, and DOTE signs off on that test plan every time it's updated, the ability to pick and choose what test I'm going to do this year is a difficult and a challenging thing. I'm going to end there because I think I've
run my gums enough. I think a key thing we need to focus on is we do need to move forward. The threat has brought A back into IAMD, and A, in my opinion, goes well beyond cruise missiles. When you look at the whole operating environment, air supremacy is no longer guaranteed, nor is air superiority. And as we move forward, as we do a review in the coming year or years, and we are going to expand it, I think, to include cruise missiles, I think it ought to be against the entire mission set, not just the missile side of it. So I'll end with that. I look forward to the dialogue and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran. What we'd like to do is have a conversation here. I'll ask a few questions, and then I'd like to leave a few minutes for questions from the audience as well. Let's start with talking about the goals of the system. Then we'll talk about questions of size and qualitative improvements and capacity, and then we'll talk about testing. Senator Sullivan talked about a goal specifically with respect to North Korea, and as I recall, he said the system should have near certainty of destroying at least 3 to 4 North Korean ICBM RVs. So I'm going to build off of that with a 3-part question. Let's start with you, Tom, and then we'll ask both Laura and Fran to respond as well to elements of the question. So is that the appropriate goal, or should we be thinking about dozens of potential North Korean RVs, right? If you project forward to the possible threat. Second, where does Iran figure in that? And third, and particularly for you, and we can take a little time on this question, should we, and for you, why should we design a system that is explicitly aimed at engaging Russian and Chinese reentry vehicles? Let me stipulate that if we design a system for North Korea and Iran, and if a missile is launched at us from Russia or China, the system would try to engage without a question. But should it take as its defining set of threats missiles and reentry vehicles from Russia and China, which we'd expect to be more advanced countermeasures as well. So first on North Korea, then Iran, then Russia, China, for starters.
Okay,
Tom.
just to get started. Okay, well, on North Korea, I don't recall the particular 3 or 4 you're speaking of, but I would say that the question of how many North Korean missiles do you defend against, that's obviously going to be in terms of the new threat assessment. One was done, as back in the 2010 BMDR, and then again kind of in 2013 timeframe. And at that point, folks looked around and said, okay, this is worse than it was in 2013. And I guess I would say what's happened since 2013. I think the new administration will take a look at that. It's not like anybody has a crystal ball to say there's going to be 37 as opposed to 39 ICBM threats that you need to deal with. That's what the new administration is going to look at. Take a look at the threat again. Last time I checked, I don't think we're better off than we were in 2010 or 2013. And so I suspect that they'll take a look at that in realistic terms.
And where do you place Iran currently in that mix as you think about the JCPOA? But recognizing that either Iran could cheat or break out, and after a period of now 8+ years, they'll begin to have more rights under that agreement to go forward with enrichment.
Right. So we didn't make any particular prediction about what's the year that the Iranian ICBM is going to come around. As you point out, the JCPOA does get looser in some respects as it goes forward. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen in 8 years. I don't think anybody knows what's going to happen with U.S.-Iran relations this year. We heard actually in the exchange earlier today, there's always the foreign assistance problem. It's not simply a function of what they do in their garage alone, but they get assistance from folks. And so, I think that frankly, the Bass administration took a look at this and said we have to hedge against that to some extent. And so, you don't wait for the ICBM plumes out of Tehran to say maybe we need to think about a radar on the east coast of the United States. So when we say let's look at some options here, Is it an LRDR-like thing? Is it SBX on the ground? Is it SBX ashore? Is it some X-band radars at some UEWR sites? Right. Right now, our sensor network is not only extraordinarily ground-based or ground and sea-based, but it's also pointed in the other direction. And so the omnidirectional, or beginning to recognize that we've been fairly focused on one particular trajectory for a long time, and our sensor network, to a remarkable degree, reflects that focus. And so I think actually what we're saying there is nothing special. You see DoD and NAA, they have been talking about that for a couple years now. So I don't think that's anything surprising. And then with respect to
I'll tell you what,
yeah.
Could I ask, there's a terrifically detailed answer on both North Korea and Iran. Let's get Laura and Fran in on that, and then we'll come back to Russia and China, because I expect that there'll be a significant conversation on that
put
as
people
well.
to sleep is what he's saying.
No. It was excellent answer. Laura, let me ask it in somewhat broader terms. Okay. Do you agree that the objective, or an objective, of the GMD system, or of U.S. national missile defense, should be to stay ahead of the threat from North Korea and Iran? In other words, that the system that's deployed at any given point in time is prepared to deal with not just the known threat, but the plausible threat for the relative near term.
Sure, I think look at a sort of verified intelligence assessment and make those plans accordingly. I mean, normally that's part of the requirements process, which isn't part of the same way we do missile defense, but I think yes, certainly a formalized process and staying ahead of the threat. I mean, I think in some senses we've been pretty lucky or fortunate that these ICBM threats have not matured nearly as quickly as may have been predicted. 2015 came and went, and we didn't see tested and deployed ICBMs from either North Korea or Iran. And Iran has made much slower progress. It's not, even its liquid-fueled space launchers haven't been tested very often, and we haven't seen its solid-fueled space launcher. Possibly there was a test last year, it's unclear. We haven't seen that maturity, so I think really being keyed in to that intelligence is important when planning.
Thank you. Fran, do you agree with that objective, and are we well postured to meet that objective today?
Yeah, I agree with the posture or the objective of shape your defense to the most likely threat. But as you build that defense, don't ignore other potential threats, I think would be the way going forward. Don't make a decision that precludes your ability from lifting and shifting. I mean, in my mind, it's always been about you want 360-degree capability. Okay, you may weight the defense against the most likely avenue or adversary, and I think that's the way we approach the problem. From the aspect of, is Iran the next guy to worry about? Yeah, probably, as you think of all those who are not on my Christmas card list. Yeah, you probably ought to keep that in your mind. And then when do you make the decision that, is there a decision point out there of, now I must act, because maybe they are a really relevant threat, and now I need to start investing. Or if I'm going to invest additional capacity, be it GBI fields, be it sensors, wherever I put that next sensor, knowing my first concern is North Korea, how can I posture it to help that defense and maybe set the stage for a defense to the east?
Thank you. All right, Tom, I'll give you relief from having to answer first on the next question after this, but let's come back to Russia and China. So on the one hand, as I noted, if either of them launched a missile at the United States, you would of course expect that the system would be directed to attempt to engage that. The question is whether we should attempt to design a system that is explicitly aimed at dealing with even limited threats or limited attacks from a Russia or China. Your report suggested so. Do you think there's a high probability of an unauthorized or accidental attack from Russia or China? Or do you believe that it's important for the United States to have the ability to negate a more limited attack for strategic reasons in the midst of a conflict? And are you concerned that, this is a leading question, are you concerned that that requirement will, in terms of both quality and quantity, begin to drive you to a much more complex system, and that it could actually compete with the ability to get the current system and the planned improvements to that system in place to deal with the North Korean and Iran?
Okay, so let me first begin by quoting back to you the 2010 BMVR, which says, and it's a very finely written sentence, that the GMD system would be used against a missile from any source, but, right? But that phrase, any source, that's the phrase that appears in our report. It's also the phrase that was used back in the early 1990s with respect to the GPALs.
But should it be designed against that?
But no, I'm getting there. I'm getting there. And so the question is, first I want to establish kind of, I think that the U.S. policy there is frequently overstated, to kind of say that we have nothing to do with that. But then the second part of that is, what would you try to do? And I think it came up earlier. I think General Mann, you emphasized the cruise missile problem, and that is explicitly one of the three things that the Missile Defeat Review tasked the department to go out and look at. Well, whose cruise missiles to the homeland are we talking about? Are we talking about North Korea's cruise missiles to the homeland? We're not talking North Korea's Air Force? No, we're probably talking about Russia or China. Congress, I suspect, had that in mind when they put that into the bill. And so I think in the first instance, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at those, call them non-strategic cruise missile threats to the homeland. I've also said we ought to be looking at that in a serious way for forces and allies in NATO. Again, sort of the non-strategic, so-called for the cruise missile threat. And I think in terms of the strategic ballistic thing, I think if you were to go that way, at most you would be pursuing the purpose of raising the threshold for the time being, or perhaps for protecting some kind of asset. And that may not be GMD, that may be something else entirely. But I think that every administration should ask and answer that question anew for itself. How do you think that makes sense?
Thank you. Thank you. Let me go to Fran on this, and Laura, I'm going to lead off the next question with you.
Sure.
And welcome your comment on this as well. Fran, are you confident that we know how to develop even a very limited system against a Russian or China threat that has advanced countermeasures? And second, are you confident that we have an understanding of how to develop and deploy a cost-effective cruise missile defense that involves advanced cruise missiles with significant stealth capabilities coming off of undersea platforms, off of SSNs?
I would tell you from my perspective on the first question, I don't think the technology is sitting on the shelf. I can't say definitively effort has been put against it, but I think I think the technology could be achieved, and it's going to take time and effort. Mm-hmm. Now your dynamic comes back to what's my resources, what's the threat I know I'm going to face versus the threat I might potentially face, and then where do I put those resources? Mm-hmm. And I think we've shaped it correctly in our overall strategy with the GMD effort. On the cruise missile defense, from my time at NORAD Northcom, and we looked at it and assessed it, that kind of goes back to the basic air defense tenets. I can't defend everything. Mm-hmm. I do not have an umbrella over the nation. So tell me what's important, and I will do my best to defend that. Do we have the capability today to give you a confident cruise missile defense? All depends how close in you want to be killing that cruise missile from the asset we're trying to defend. Mm-hmm. I'll be honest, I've said it before, the loss of JLENS is a tremendous loss for cruise missile defense capability. Mm-hmm. As ugly as many people thought it was and as laughable as they thought it was, I was in Key West last week. We still got aerostats down there flying. They must be contributing to the mission set because they've been there a long time. We got them flying over in the AOR, in CENTCOM's AOR. And I know we've lost them and we've replaced them. They've been contributing. So the JLENS capability, or a capability like JLENS, I think is essential to getting after cruise missile, maybe essential to getting after UAVs.
I agree with that, that final comment in particular. Laura, in the interest of time and to let the audience come in, I'm going to ask just one more question, but I'll let each of you respond as well. Laura, as you think about the requirements and acquisition process that's been used for the GMD system, if you were going to now use regular order essentially for both requirements and acquisition, what do you think? How would you apply it? In other words, would you stand down current efforts to improve the system pending going back through the process? Would you say, okay, as of a certain point in the future, we're going to apply this regular order acquisition and requirements approach? Or how would you do that? And second, on testing, what do you think would be an appropriate number of tests per year on average, understanding that, as Fran pointed out, it varies by the place the program is with respect to its development. But for an operational system, one would expect a regular pattern of tests. What are your thoughts on, so first on requirements and acquisition, second on the timing and battle rhythm for testing?
Well, thanks, Jim. Those are actually not easy questions. I'm not, again, an acquisitions expert, and I know that we are flush with them here in Washington, D.C. But the way I would look at it is what I would ask from that requirements system is to save us from our worst impulses or to set up the incentives right. If we're not testing as hard as we can because we want to see successes, and if a system like the GMD doesn't have a clear path to being owned by a service and in a service's budget, for example, as something goes through developmental and operational testing and then gets offloaded into someone like Aegis has moved out or THAAD's moved out, is that acquisitions process still doing what it ought to do to move the GMD system forward? In the sense that, is there a credible way to replicate, if it doesn't go into J5000, for example, to make sure that interceptors don't get fielded before they're well tested, right? Because if normally you'll have to go through operational tests in order to be procured, and Tom makes a really good point in his report about the GMD budget sort of acting like a procurement fund, but really being RDT&E funding, which really sets up this dichotomy where it's perpetually in research and development.
Just to be clear, if
Yes.
I could, do you think that the GBIs in the ground today have been adequately tested?
I don't.
And do you therefore think that they should be pulled out of their holes, and so that the United States would have no defense at all? Or do you think that we should go from where we are and have what defense we can based on what appears to be a very real and growing North Korea threat?
I would leave them in the ground, of course, yes. And I would maybe experiment with the RKV and really and put it through sort of one of these, a J5000 process or a better description of that.
Okay.
In terms of testing, I think testing officials have often said, and I think we've just heard this from General Mann, that it's pretty hard to up the tempo because there's a lot of prep and a lot of analysis afterward. And even sort of throwing money at that problem doesn't really make it much better.
Only so many places I can launch that big missile from towards the two test sites that I potentially can launch the Interceptor from. So it's a difficult dynamic.
Fran, do we have a cultural problem in expecting test success? And should we be addressing that?
I think we do have a cultural problem that every time we launch an Interceptor, we expect to see something go bang and flash in the sky, or flash and bang. That's the way it should happen, I guess. But I mean, I agree in one sense, Laura, having been on joint staff, service staff, and as you say you complain about something long enough, you end up on the other staff where you're responsible for it, or play in the solution set. The agency and the GMD have kind of been given a carte blanche, go forth and do. Okay, NMD, going back to the 90s, we had a requirement document on the shelf. You could pull it down. What's it supposed to do? How's it supposed to do it? I'm not so certain I could go find that today if I had to for the GMD system. But on the other hand, when you look at the JSIDS process and its rigidity and it's cut and dry, buddy, deliver the KPP or don't, or you're done. Boy, that's a grand waste of effort, time, and money. So we need something maybe in between of what are we going to do with this capability? What do you hope to achieve with this capability? Put your marks on the wall.
Good.
Then let's develop, let's test, and if you come back with a 67% score against a requirement of 85% or 90%, well, then we ought to have the dialogue. If I'm at 65% today, 67% isn't much value added. If I'm 0 today, 67% is pretty good. You know, the comment, you know, Babe Ruth, how many times he get on base? A little bit more than a third. But he's a hero, isn't he?
Can I jump back on that
go ahead,
real quick?
go ahead.
You know, I think that, again, the 2010 BMDR looked at this and decided that they saw no benefit to moving MDA back to the to that JSIDS process. You know, maybe there's insufficient folks looking over the shoulders. Maybe that's possible. Sounds like there's quite a bit of oversight and auditing going on for last time I checked at MDA, but pause right there. I would throw this back that, you know, THAAD under that process wasn't doing so great in the 1990s. And what do we see with the THAAD and the SM that has gone forward outside of that process? What's the record again? 13 for 13 for THAAD, 23 or 24 out of 28 or thereabouts for Aegis. How do you account for that record and that development progress outside of the JSIDS? And this, if that's the cause of GMD's problem, how do you account for that? I think basically the bottom line is the EKB never got the design turn. Everybody knew it was a prototype back in 2004, and it never got that second wave, and that's why we're sitting here life extending it along, and that's why the next design RKV is so important.
Tom, thank you. We are almost up at 11:30. I have to ask you, how hard is our stop? Because
We'll probably have a couple minutes.
let's go over a couple minutes. So raise your hand, please. Wait for the microphone. And gentleman in the second row, please. If you'd let us know your name before you ask your question.
John Harper with National Defense Magazine. Tom, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the importance of space-based sensors, and Senator Sullivan touched upon that as well earlier this morning. I was hoping the panel could flesh that out a little bit more. You know, obviously we have satellites that can detect missile launches, but what would a space-based, a layered system entail? And then, you know, looking ahead to the Missile Defense Agency's plans to sort of address this capability, how realistic are they from either a technical or a budgetary perspective?
So I actually think that this is maybe the most important, so good question, most important thing that maybe ought to be added to what we're doing now, you know, after RKV. And that is to say that first of all, every administration, last 5 administrations, have had a space-based central layer for not merely detection, but tracking and discrimination. Every single one of them has had it on paper as a critical element of long-range missile defense. And nobody's done it. It, for whatever reason, continues to get pushed back. And so this is something that I think that the administration has indicated they want to look at, and they should look at. And Admiral Searing, Vice Admiral Searing has said that where the threat is going, space is a must. But right now, it continues to be a maybe because we don't have it underway. Now, having said that, there's 2 demonstrator satellites, right, in orbit. They're demonstrating. They've dramatically increased the launch on remote range of Aegis already in the past couple of years, but they haven't finished that out. They don't necessarily have to be Battlestar Galacticas. A more distributed, smaller, cheaper architecture might also be possible. Both looking at that.
Thank you, Tom. Richard.
Thank you. Richard Fieldhouse, former Armed Services, Senate Armed Services Committee staffer, currently independent consultant type. Thank you all. I want to ask a sort of a question that gets somewhat at your answer to Jim on Russia and China, and somewhat to the discussion of testing. And it wasn't clear to me, Tom, from your answer. So I'll put it this way. Would you agree that any of our homeland missile defense efforts should both be intended to and have the effect of improving our security relative to, say, the strategic stability question, which is a Russia-China question, and that all our missile defense systems should be tested and demonstrated to work effectively before they're deployed, right? And that goes to all of you. The Russia-China issue, which I think is what Jim was getting at, is if we say we're going to design a system specifically to try to intercept their strategic missile systems, it's relatively easy for them to increase their capacity, their systems, overwhelm, et cetera. So I wanted to sort of try to pin you down on that.
Yeah. So what I would say is, and I'm going to quote back another one of your colleagues, Rose Gottsmuller, who said in 2014 that, even at 44, we are 24 less than the number of interceptors that Moscow deploys today. And we don't sit around agonizing over the impact on strategic stability that they have for 68 on us. And by the way, they're pretty upfront about the fact that that's about us. The reason I pull out that quote is I think we're just so far away from that in terms of number as much as anything. And so while I think that the systems that we are advancing today, SMs as well as GMD, are continuing to blur the line between national and regional, as it were, I think that we're just so far from that. And if you get to a point where you begin to have that capability, you would still have to have a lot of numbers to really affect that strategic stability. And I think actually that you could have improvement on strategic stability rather than hurting it. Well, look, that was the concept of safeguard, right? Was to protect certain critical assets and raise the threshold and support the overall deterrence posture. It's not crazy. That's been kicked around many times. Making sure that you have strategic survivability for different things. That's what informs strategic stability. And so that's actually where we've emphasized when we talk about Russia here is look at how it might improve strategic stability, not as some kind of perfect umbrella, but with these particular side issues.
I'll put a name to my concern very briefly, and that is that if the requirement is established to be able to deal with even relatively limited Russian and Chinese threats, that resources will go toward that end. I'm skeptical that we have the ability to defeat the advanced countermeasures of today, let alone those of tomorrow. And if we begin to pursue that, and if people believe that it must be done, they may come to say, for example, okay, we're going to throw more money at the qualitative side, and that could be a large hole, if not an infinite hole. And secondly, let's say it's 10% effective, let's build 10 times more. So I'm concerned about the cost implications and then the knock-on effects on stability in the event that Russians and Chinese believe our system may be more capable than it is as they are doing their planning. And I think it's an important set of issues that I think this administration should address. I don't rule out the possibility of looking at that capability. And as I said, I believe that if a missile is launched at the United States, that whatever system we have should try to engage it.
But would you say that same thing for cruise missile threats?
The challenge with cruise missile threats is that we don't yet have a viable concept for nationwide defense. Fran alluded to this. And what we do have a reasonable concept for, and it ain't cheap, as you know, is for selective defense of the national capital and so on. And
but you don't see that as an impediment to strategic stability? Is selective defense?
No, I don't. No, I don't, and I don't disagree with your point there.
Yep.
I think what we'll do is have one more question, and the gentleman here in front.
Yes, I'm Russell King, retired federal employee. I have a question about missile threats from the south. There's a particular missile advocacy organization that says the Gulf Coast is particularly vulnerable for missiles coming from the south, including missiles flown over the South Pole. And as we know, in Latin America, there are regimes like the Maduro regime in Venezuela. They have close relationships with missile defense powers. And in 1962, we had a threat coming from Cuba. But if I look at figure ES3, I'm not seeing any missile defense assets south of the Gulf Coast or at the Gulf Coast. I thought Eglin Air Force Base had some sort of missile defense assets, but I'm not sure. How do we consider the threats from the south? Are they important enough to put in this missile defense framework?
Tom, do you want to go?
There's nothing there. There's nothing there. Not just cruise, but ballistic. We're all looking in the other direction. You detect it, but you wouldn't be able to do much about it. You could correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think that this is why we ought to look for maybe, what are you trying to defend against? Is it the Venezuelan IRBM program? I don't know what that is, but I think that the principle of flexibility and mobility might be more valuable, like transportable and all these other sort of things, might be more valuable so that when something happens, if it happens, we're able to adapt to it. And that's actually what we emphasize in the report is you can't line the United States coastline with defenses,
Yeah, we can't go back to Conrad, where we had Continental Regional Air Defense of the 50s and 60s. The past year, I've been part of a series of tabletop exercises that the Missile Defense Agency has done for the combatant commanders. For some of the other combatant commanders, not NORTHCOM, we have done off-axis attack, where we picked a nation, who today is not really an adversary, but we've declared, we're playing 20, 30 in the future. Their governments come apart, and they're an adversary today, and they have a capability, be it limited. And we roll that across the table. Once the combatant commander's got the assets he's got in that year, whatever it is, Son of Thad, Aegis, SM-6 or 7 or 8 or whatever, and we play the game to say, well, this is the capability you got, and now you got a different threat. How do you deal with it? I have not known, although I was part of a test when I was at NORAD NORTHCOM, about if we had a threat out of South America, how would we deal with it? And at that time, I haven't seen coverage diagrams, so I can't tell you what Aegis could do if I put an Aegis ship. Might be able to deal with it in the Gulf, or I put an Aegis ship on the other side of Mexico. But they played THAAD at the time. Okay, I'll defend Dallas. You want New Orleans covered? I'll cover New Orleans. But I am not covering the state of Texas. I'm not covering, it's selective what I could do at that time with the technology we had. But that's the dynamic, the what if. Hey, what if Canada goes rogue? What are we going to do then? So you kind of focus on who's the bad guy today, who's the potential bad guy, and then the what ifs and the wild ones. You kind of say, yeah, that's an interesting point. We could roll that into an exercise once and see how people deal with it.
Fred, I think that's a good place for us to conclude. I just observe that as both of you and Tom noted, that the mobile and particular sea-based assets give us some ability to deal with any threat that might emerge within the region. And in the meantime, we've got our hands full, first and foremost, with North Korea and with establishing a posture vis-a-vis Iran to reduce their incentives to want to go back to their nuclear program with respect to, because they could see that they would not be able to threaten the United States. They have other aims for or they would have other aims to restart. But it's in my view, an important part of our deterrence posture vis-a-vis Iran as well. And those two are pretty significant challenges, and I'd like to see us address them well as a starting point. Thank you all for being here today. Please join me in a round of applause for our great panelists.